Hello, I'm Peter. I'm so glad you could join me for tonight's journey. One mistake with your fire, and you wouldn't just get cold, you simply wouldn't wake up. We're diving deep tonight into what survival really meant during the most catastrophic winter in American frontier history. The winter of 1886 to 87. The winter that killed more cattle than all the Native American raids, all the droughts and all the diseases combined. The winter they simply called the Great Die-Up. And here's what fascinates me most about this story. It wasn't just about the cold. It was about what that brutal cold revealed. About the warmth people created when everything around them had turned to ice. About the ingenious ways they learned to survive brutal cold in the Wild West, when every single day was a test of will and every night was a victory just to see morning. So before you get too comfortable, if you're finding value in these nocturnal journeys through history, I'd genuinely appreciate you taking a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. But only if you're truly enjoying what we do here. No pressure. Just if it helps you sleep, helps you dream, helps you travel through time from the comfort of wherever you are, then maybe consider it. And I'm always curious. Super curious, actually. Where in the world are you listening from? Right now, what time is it where you are? Drop a comment below with your location and the hour. It never ceases to amaze me how people across every continent in every time zone are drifting off to these same stories. Someone in Tokyo at dawn, someone in London at midnight, someone in Kansas City in the quiet hours before sleep. All of us connected by these threads of history. Now, dim the lights if you can. Maybe turn on a fan for that gentle white noise. Get yourself into that cozy spot, that perfect position where your body just wants to sink deeper into whatever you're lying on. Just breathe with me now. Slow in, hold it, and slow out. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. Let the story carry you. There is nothing to do right now, nowhere to be. Just here, warm and safe. Let's drift back through the years, back to a time when winter didn't just inconvenience you. It tested everything you were made of. Picture this with me, if you will. It's late November 1886. You're waking up in your cabin on the Great Plains, somewhere in what would become Montana. Maybe the Dakotas, perhaps Wyoming. The exact location doesn't matter so much as what you're about to face. But let's back up a moment. Let's understand what came before, because the winter that's about to arrive didn't come from nowhere. It was built on a foundation of mistakes, of greed, of a fundamental misunderstanding of how this land actually worked. The summer before had been brutal in its own way. Not cold, but dry. Devastatingly dry. The kind of drought that turns the endless grasslands brittle and brown. Imagine prairie that usually waves like an ocean thick with buffalo grass and grama grass, now crackling under your feet like ancient paper. The massive herds of cattle, hundreds of thousands of them, had grazed these plains down to nothing, down past the green, down past the roots, down to bare earth in some places. See, what had happened was this. And this is important to understand the catastrophe that's coming. Investors from back east, from England, from Scotland, had poured millions of dollars into what they called the beef bonanza. They'd been told that cattle on the open range basically raised themselves, that you could just turn them loose on this ocean of grass and come back in a few years to collect your fortune. Free grass, free water, free money. Except nothing in nature is free, and nature always collects its debts. So by the time November 1886 rolls around, you've got a landscape stripped bare cattle that have gone into winter, thin and weak, and, if you're paying attention, some troubling signs. The birds migrating earlier than usual. The wild animals growing thicker coats than anyone can remember. The old-timers. The trappers who'd been in these mountains for decades. They're shaking their heads and talking about a hard winter coming. But you're probably not too worried yet. You've seen cold before. Right, last winter was tough, but you made it through. You've got your cabin. You've got some supplies put by. You've got your cattle out there somewhere on the range. They're hardy Texas Longhorns, or maybe Herefords bred for the cold. They'll be fine. Then one morning in late November, you wake up and something's different. The quality of the silence is what hits you first. It's not just quiet, it's the kind of silence that has weight, has presence, the kind of silence that presses against your ears. You're lying there in your bed, and let me describe what that bed actually is. Because it's not what you're sleeping in right now, that's for certain. You're on a mattress, if you can call it that, made of dried prairie grass, or corn husks stuffed into a ticking, made from flour sacks sewn together. Maybe, if you're fortunate, you've got some straw mixed in. It crackles when you move. On top of you layers. Wool blankets, probably scratchy against your skin. Maybe a buffalo robe, if you were smart enough to trade with the native folks before this became a problem. Or maybe just more quilts made from scraps, each one sewn by hand through long summer evenings, when sewing by candlelight didn't seem quite so precious. Your cabin is small, maybe 14 feet by 16 feet. That's it. That's your entire world for the next several months. The walls are thick, though, 3 feet thick in some places, made from blocks of sod, actual chunks of earth held together by the tangled roots of prairie grass stacked like bricks. Some people called them Nebraska marble, with a kind of bitter humor. And lying there in that pre-dawn darkness, you notice your breath. You can see it. Inside your cabin. Inside what's supposed to be shelter. That's when you know. You gather your courage, and believe me, it takes courage to leave that cocoon of quilts and wool. The air in the cabin is so cold, it actually hurts to breathe. You can feel it in your teeth, in your lungs. It's not just cold, it's aggressive. You swing your feet out. They land on a floor so cold it feels wet, even though it's perfectly dry. And you shuffle over to the small window. It's not glass. Glass was expensive and broke too easily. It's oiled paper stretched across the frame. But even through that cloudy membrane you can see white. Nothing but white. Not the bright white of fresh snow on a sunny day. This is different. This is the white of nothingness. The white of erased existence. It's as if someone took the world and just deleted it. The wind. Oh, the wind. It's not howling. That's not quite right. It's moaning. A low, constant sound that seems to come from the earth itself. From the sky. From everywhere and nowhere. A sound that will become the soundtrack to your life for the next, well, you don't know how long yet. Weeks, months. You need to get the fire going. That's the first task of every single day now. Your stove, if you're lucky enough to have one, is a cast iron beast sitting in the middle of the cabin. If you're not lucky, it's a fireplace made of stone or sod. And you're going to lose most of your heat up a chimney that draws air in as much as it lets smoke out. The wood, You hope you have enough wood. You laid in what you thought was plenty back in October. You and maybe a neighbor or two spent days cutting and hauling cottonwood from the few creek beds that had trees. But cottonwood burns fast, fast and hot, and then it's gone. You're going to need to stretch it, mix it with something else, that something else. And this is where it gets interesting. Might be twisted hay. You take handfuls of dried prairie grass and twist them into tight bundles, tight enough that they burn slowly like candles made of grass. It's an art. Twist too loose and it burns up in seconds. Twist too tight and it won't catch. Just right, and a bundle the size of your forearm will burn for maybe 10-15 minutes. Or, and this is going to sound strange to modern ears, you might burn buffalo chips, dried buffalo dung, or cattle dung, though cattle chips weren't quite as good. The buffalo were mostly gone by 1886, slaughtered nearly to extinction, but their legacy remained in the form of these dried, nearly odorless fuel sources scattered across the prairie. And you know what? It worked. Buffalo chips burned hot, burned clean, and didn't create much smoke. The native peoples had been using them for centuries. Now the settlers, in their desperation to survive the brutal cold in the Wild West, were learning the same lessons. So, there you are. Cold cabin, colder world outside, and a fire that needs tending before you can do anything else. Before you can even think about eating, before you can check on your animals, before you can be human in any meaningful way. This is day one, and the winter has barely begun. Let's take a moment here and just breathe with that image. Feel what it would have been like. The cold pressing in from all sides. The darkness. Because the sun, when it finally rises, won't really rise. It'll just turn the black into grey. The isolation. Because your nearest neighbour is probably a mile away, maybe two. And in weather like this, they might as well be on the moon. But here's what's remarkable. Here's what we're going to discover together as this night unfolds. People didn't just survive this. They survived it without electric heaters, without central heating, without weather apps warning them what was coming. They survived it with ingenuity, with community, with a kind of stubborn resilience that's almost hard to fathom from our comfortable climate-controlled present. So let your breathing slow. Let your body settle deeper into wherever you are right now. Probably somewhere warm, somewhere safe. And let's step fully into this frozen world together. Let's experience what it really meant to live through the winter that changed the American West forever. As evening settles on that first day of serious cold, you're back inside your cabin after whatever work you managed to do outside. And I want to take you on a tour of this space because understanding it, really feeling what it was like, is essential to understanding how people survived. Listen closely for a moment. Really listen. Can you hear the wind? It's not a howl right now, just a high, thin whistle outside. Whew, barely there, far away. Inside, the fire shifts in the iron stove. A soft pop, a gentle hiss as the sap boils. Comforting. On the oiled paper window, the snow taps. Tick, tick, tick. Light as sand. And then, crack. The sharp report of a timber contracting in the deep freeze. A single, loud heartbeat of the house. Then, silence again. The cabin is dim. There's the orange glow from your stove and maybe, one candle burning if you're feeling wealthy enough to spare it. Candles were made from rendered animal fat, usually beef tallow, and they smelled like, Well, like burning meat. Not pleasant, but not horrible either. Just a constant reminder that everything in this life came from making use of what you had. The walls around you are those thick blocks of sod we mentioned. Prairie earth cut into bricks stacked and mortared with more mud. And inside those walls, the dirt itself is frozen now. You can see frost on the inner surface in the corners where the stove's heat doesn't quite reach. But here's the genius of it. Those 3-foot thick walls are actually saving your life. Stone or wood conducts cold easily, but earth is an insulator. Not a great one, but good enough. The massive thermal mass of those walls means that once you get them even slightly warm, they hold onto that heat. Slowly, grudgingly, but they hold it. Native American earth lodges used the same principle. These settlers, mostly from Europe, where they'd never seen anything like the brutal cold of the Wild West plains, had learned from necessity and from observation. Your floor is dirt, just packed earth covered with whatever scraps of fabric or hide you could spare. Some people braided rugs from old clothing. Some laid down pine needles or straw. But mostly it was just dirt. And that dirt, too, was frozen. Your feet were never truly warm unless you were right by the fire. The ceiling. Look up with me here. The ceiling is low, maybe 7 feet at the highest point. It's made from whatever wood you could find, probably rough-cut planks, or just whole cottonwood logs laid across. Then covered with a layer of brush, then tar paper if you could afford it, then sod on top of that. Grass literally growing on your roof. In summer, wildflowers would bloom up there. But now in winter, it's just a thick layer of frozen earth and dead vegetation. And it leaks, not water. Everything's frozen. But dirt. Dirt constantly sifting down, especially when the wind really starts to blow and the whole structure shakes. You'd wake up with a fine layer of dust on your face, in your hair, on your blankets. Some people tacked up muslin or old sheets as a ceiling cloth to catch the dirt. But then you had to take those down and shake them out regularly, which meant releasing all that dust at once in a choking cloud. This was home. This was shelter. This was civilization's edge. Let me paint you the whole interior. Against one wall, your bed. That crackling grass mattress on a simple frame if you had a frame. Maybe just the mattress on the floor. Children, if you had them, might sleep in a loft. A small platform built near the ceiling where the warmest air collected. Or they'd sleep on the floor near the stove bundled in whatever you could spare. Against another wall, a rough table. Maybe some chairs, maybe just benches made from split logs. This table served every purpose. Eating, working, treating injuries, writing letters to family back east that might never arrive if the mail train couldn't get through. Your food supplies. Oh, this is important. You'd have barrels. Flour barrel probably mostly empty by midwinter. A barrel of salt. Salt was precious, life-giving. You used it to preserve meat to make food palatable to stay alive. Cans of goods if you'd been able to afford them from the general store last fall. Dried beans, endless dried beans. Some people lived on little else through the winter. Beans and cornbread and coffee. Coffee. Let's talk about coffee for a moment, because it was sacred. Not like we think of coffee now as a casual morning beverage. Coffee was the thing that made you human, that reminded you life was worth living. When supplies ran low, people would roast barley or wheat, or even acorns trying to make something that tasted coffee-like. The act of holding a hot cup feeling that warmth spread through your cold fingers. That was sometimes the only pleasure in an entire day, hanging from nails driven into the walls. Clothes, your spare shirt, your coat, anything you weren't wearing, because there was no closet, no dresser. Whatever you owned, you could see. And speaking of clothes, let's talk about what you're actually wearing right now, sitting by your stove as darkness thickens outside. You're layered. Oh, are you layered? Against your skin underwear made from wool. Itchy, scratchy wool. But wool had this magical property. It stayed warm even when wet. Cotton would soak up sweat and freeze against your skin. Linen was for summer. Wool was survival. Over that, maybe a cotton or flannel shirt. Then a vest. Then a heavier wool shirt or jacket. On your legs, wool trousers. Possibly 2 pairs. Your feet. This is where it got creative. You'd have wool socks, probably multiple pairs. Then boots. But boots weren't like modern insulated boots. They were leather, and leather gets cold. Some people stuffed dried grass inside their boots for insulation. Others wrapped their feet in pieces of old blanket before putting on their socks. Women had it harder in some ways. The fashion of the era demanded skirts. Skirts that dragged in the snow and got heavy with ice. But practical frontier women modified things. They wore wool trousers underneath their skirts, scandalous as that might have seemed to society folks. They wore multiple petticoats, quilted if possible. Anything to create layers of dead airspace that would trap body heat. And here's a detail that really brings it home. People often slept in most of these clothes. You didn't get undressed for bed. You maybe took off your outer layer and your boots, but that's it. Getting undressed meant exposing your skin to cold air, which meant losing precious body heat, which meant taking longer to warm up again. Your cabin has 1 or maybe 2 windows, small ones, and they're shuttered now because even that oiled paper isn't much barrier against the cold. So, you're living in semi-darkness. Your body clock starts to shift. You sleep when it's dark, which is a lot of the time. You wake when there's enough light to work. But day and night start to lose meaning. There's cold dark and slightly less cold grey. That's about it. The stove. Let's come back to the stove because it's the heart of everything. You feed it constantly. Every couple of hours, day and night, someone has to wake up and add fuel. Let the fire die and the cabin temperature plummets. How fast in weather that's 40 below, you could go from barely tolerable to life-threatening cold in under an hour. Families worked in shifts. One person would tend the fire while others slept. Then they'd swap. Sleep became fragmented, broken into chunks. You'd fall into deep exhaustion for a few hours, then wake, feed the fire, maybe eat something, then try to sleep again. And the sounds. Oh, the sounds of the cabin at night. The wind, always. The wind moaning and shrieking, and sometimes slamming against the walls so hard the whole structure shuddered. The fire crackling and hissing. The cabin itself, creaking and groaning as frozen timbers contracted, as frozen sod walls shifted microscopic amounts. Sometimes you'd hear a crack like a gunshot when something froze and split. And outside, the silence, or not quite silence. Sometimes, on the clearest, coldest nights, you could hear the cattle. If they were close enough, if the wind was right, you'd hear them lowing, calling out in distress and hunger and cold. And there was nothing you could do. Absolutely nothing. They were out there in it, and you were in here, and all you could do was hope they'd figured out how to survive the brutal cold of the Wild West winter on their own. That sound, those distant, plaintive calls of suffering animals, that was one of the hardest things to bear, harder than the cold itself for many people. The knowledge that creatures under your care were dying, and you were powerless to save them. But let's not dwell there. Let's instead think about the small comforts. Because there were small comforts even in this frozen world. Maybe you'd managed to shoot a rabbit or a prairie chicken earlier in the fall, and you'd save the pelt. Now it's a pair of mittens or a patch on your coat. Maybe you'd found a pretty stone back in summer and brought it home, and now it sits on your table catching firelight, reminding you that beauty exists. Maybe you have a book, just one read so many times you know passages by heart. The Bible was common, or a farmer's almanac, or maybe, if you were educated and had connections back east, some Shakespeare, some poetry, words that transported you out of this frozen cabin to other places other times. Maybe you play music, a harmonica if you're lucky, a fiddle if you're skilled and prosperous enough to own one. Simple songs, folk songs, songs from the old country wherever that was. Songs that connected you to who you were before you came to this hard land. And maybe, you talk, really talk. Not just about practical things like we need more wood or the cow needs milking, but about dreams, about the spring that will come, about what you'll plant when the ground thaws, about the family you left behind, about whether this gamble, this bet you made by coming west, will pay off or destroy you. Because that's what this was, a gamble. Every single person in these scattered cabins across the Great Plains was gambling that they could outlast the brutal cold, outlast the isolation, outlast the despair, and come through to some kind of prosperity on the other side. Some would win that bet. Many would lose. But tonight, in this moment, you're still in the fight. You're still here. The fire's burning. You're breathing. Your heart's beating. And outside, the eternal winter of 1886 presses against your walls, testing your resolve. Let yourself feel that. The smallness of human warmth against the vastness of the cold. The fragility of shelter. The preciousness of fire. And now, let's step outside briefly, just for a moment. Because to understand survival, you need to understand what you're surviving against. The door of your cabin. It's not just a door. It's a barrier between two different worlds. Inside survival, outside the possibility of death. So opening it isn't casual, it's a decision. But you have to open it, because you need to check on things. The livestock, if you have any. The woodpile. The path to the outhouse. Because yes, even in 40 below weather, biology doesn't stop. So you bundle up. On goes your heaviest coat. Probably wool, maybe lined with blanket scraps. Maybe you have a buffalo robe coat if you were wise enough or wealthy enough. On goes your scarf wrapped around your face so only your eyes show. On go your mittens. And these are interesting because mittens were better than gloves. Gloves separated your fingers, and each finger got cold. Mittens kept them together so they could share warmth. On goes your hat, pulled down over your ears. Some people made earmuffs from rabbit fur or sheep's wool. Frostbite of the ears was common and disfiguring. You take a deep breath of the relatively warm cabin air, knowing what's coming. And you crack the door. The cold hits you like a physical blow. Not metaphorically. Actually, physically. It's hard to describe to someone who's never experienced genuine, dangerous cold. It doesn't just feel cold. It hurts. It's aggressive. Malevolent. It wants inside your body, and it pushes against every exposed surface trying to get in. The wind velocity matters enormously. Still air at 20 below is survivable with proper clothing. Wind at 20 below creates what we now call wind chill. But they didn't have that term then. They just knew that wind made cold worse. Wind at 20 below can create an effective temperature of -60 or more. At that temperature, exposed skin freezes in under 5 minutes. Frost forms instantly on the wool scarf covering your mouth as the moisture from your breath condenses and freezes. Your eyelashes freeze together. If you're not careful about how you breathe, the moisture in your nose freezes, and it becomes difficult to draw air through your nostrils. You learn to breathe slowly through the scarf, warming the air slightly before it hits your lungs. The snow. In the feeble light from your cabin door, you can see it. The snow that fell isn't like snow in milder climates. It's not the fat, wet flakes that fall softly and pile up into easily scooped mounds. This is prairie snow, cold snow. The flakes are tiny, hard, almost like pellets of ice, and the wind drives them horizontally, not down but across. It scours, it sandblasts, it gets into every seam, every gap, every crack, and it drifts. Oh, how it drifts. The flat prairie offers no barrier to wind, so the snow piles up wherever it hits an obstacle. Against your cabin wall, there might be a drift 6, 8, 10 feet high. In the swales and coulees, the little valleys and depressions that crease the plains, drifts could be 20, 30 feet deep. Cattle would walk into these thinking they'd found shelter from the wind, and they'd sink and be unable to climb out. By morning, they'd be buried. By spring, they'd be... Let's not go there yet. The stars on a clear night between storms are astonishing. With no light pollution, no moisture in the air, they blaze. The Milky Way is a river of light. You can see enough to walk by starlight alone, and it's beautiful in a terrible, austere way. This beauty that can kill you. The cold does strange things to sound. At extreme temperatures, sound travels differently, carries farther. Your footsteps in the snow, that satisfying crunch we associate with walking in snow, that sound changes. At 40 below, snow doesn't crunch. It squeaks. Almost a glassy, crystalline sound. It's one of those details that you wouldn't know unless you'd experienced it. And the silence. Between the gusts of wind, the silence is profound, total. In our modern world, there's always some kind of ambient noise. The hum of electricity, distant traffic, airplanes, something. But out there on the prairie in 1886, in the deep of winter, in the middle of the night, there was nothing. An absence of sound so complete it pressed on your ears like pressure. Now, the physics of what's happening to you out here. Your body is a heat-generating machine burning calories to maintain your core temperature at 98.6 degrees. But heat always moves from hot to cold. Always. Inexorably. So your body heat is constantly radiating away into the frigid air. Your extremities, fingers, toes, nose, ears are the most vulnerable. They're far from your heart, so blood flow to them is reduced. And they have high surface area relative to their mass, so they lose heat rapidly. Your body, in its wisdom, will actually reduce blood flow to your extremities to preserve your core. Better to lose a finger than die. That's the calculation your cardiovascular system is making without consulting you. Frostbite happens in stages. First comes frostnip, a whitening of the skin numbness, but no permanent damage if you warm it carefully. Then superficial frostbite. The skin freezes, ice crystals form in the tissue, but deeper layers are okay. Then deep frostbite. Everything freezes, solid ice crystals tear apart cells, and when it thaws, if it thaws, gangrene often sets in. Amputation was common for people who survived severe frostbite. Hypothermia is the other killer. As your core temperature drops, you go through stages. At 95 degrees core temperature, you start shivering violently. Your body is trying to generate heat through muscle activity. At 93 degrees, the shivering becomes extreme and you lose fine motor control. Can't button buttons, can't strike a match. At 90 degrees, you stop shivering. That's bad. That means your body is giving up. At 88 degrees, you become confused, irrational. At 86 degrees, unconscious. Below that, death. The terrifying thing about hypothermia is that it impairs your judgment right when you most need good judgment. There are documented cases of hypothermia victims engaging in paradoxical undressing. They feel hot, burning hot, and they remove their clothes. They're found frozen to death, naked, having actively accelerated their own demise because their brain was too cold to function correctly. Out here right now, as you stand in your doorway assessing the night, all of these processes are beginning. Your body is fighting hard. Every calorie you ate today is being burned to maintain that crucial 98.6 degrees. You need to do what you came out here to do quickly. Check the animals, grab more fuel, get back inside, because every minute out here is dangerous. Your cattle, if you can see them, if they're anywhere near, are standing with their backs to the wind. That's instinct. Protect your face, your eyes, your vulnerable front. Their long winter coats are fluffed up, creating dead airspace for insulation. But it's not enough. Not for weather like this. Not when it goes on day after day, week after week. Cattle that originated in Texas, bred for heat tolerance, were dying in huge numbers. They simply didn't have the genetic adaptation for this. British breeds like Herefords, though somewhat more cold-adapted, were starving because they couldn't paw through the crusted snow to find grass the way the old longhorns could. And there was a new problem this year. Something that would become legendary in the history of the American West, though that history hadn't been written yet. The drift fences. See, the big cattle companies had started putting up barbed wire fences. Miles and miles of them. Designed to keep cattle from drifting south with the winter storms to keep them on company land. But cattle have an instinct when a bad storm hits. They turn their backs to it, and they walk, and walk, and walk. They'll go 20, 30 miles if they can, always moving away from the wind looking for shelter. But now there were fences, so the cattle would drift until they hit the fence, and then they'd pile up. Hundreds of them, thousands of them, all pushed by the storm until they were pressed against the wire. And they'd freeze there, standing up, packed so tight that the ones in the middle couldn't even fall down. Just a solid mass of frozen cattle stretching along the fence line for miles. In spring, when it all finally melted, the sight was apocalyptic. Bones and hide and wire all tangled together. The stench, they said you could smell it for miles. And cowboys riding the range, checking for survivors, checking the damage. They'd come across these scenes and just weep. Grown men, hard men, sobbing at the scale of the waste and the suffering. But that's spring. Right now, in the midst of it, you don't know the full scale of what's happening. You know your own small world, your own struggle, the cold pressing in, the dark, the wind. You do your tasks. You work fast with the economy of motion that comes from experience. You don't waste a single movement because every movement exposes you to more cold. And then you're back inside, slamming the door, gasping. And here's what's interesting. The cabin feels warm now, gloriously warm. Even though it's probably still below 50 degrees in there, maybe colder. But it's 50 degrees warmer than outside. It's shelter, it's life. And you're grateful in a way that people in centrally heated homes can never quite understand. You warm yourself by the fire, carefully, not too fast, because rapid rewarming can cause pain and damage. Your hands and face tingle and burn as blood flow returns. It's called the frosties, and it hurts more than the initial cold did. And then you settle back in. Maybe you have a cup of that precious coffee. Maybe you just wrap your hands around the warm stove and breathe. Because you made it. You survived another encounter with the brutal cold of the Wild West. But there will be another. In a few hours, you'll have to go out again. And again. Day after day. Night after night. This is your life now. This is survival. Not some abstract concept, but a concrete moment-to-moment reality. Stay warm. Stay alive. See tomorrow. The wind howls, the cabin creaks, the fire burns. And you endure. Let that image settle. Feel the relief of being back inside, the gratitude for walls and fire and shelter. And as you breathe, as you relax into your warm bed in your warm room, take a moment to appreciate what you have. The ease, the comfort, the security. Because what we're experiencing tonight through story and imagination was daily life for hundreds of thousands of people. This was normal. This was just winter. And now, let's talk about sleep. About what it meant to rest in this frozen world. Sleep in the winter of 1886 was not the simple act we know today. You didn't just fall into bed exhausted and wake refreshed. Sleep was tactical, strategic, a carefully managed process of heat conservation and safety monitoring. Your bed, as I mentioned, was probably a grass or corn husk mattress. But let's talk about what else you'd do to make it survivable. First, you'd sleep close to the stove, as close as safely possible. Because at night, even with the fire going, the far corners of the cabin would drop to near freezing. But near the stove, you might maintain 40, even 50 degrees. That's the difference between sleeping and just surviving the night. Your bedding strategy, this is fascinating, was all about trapping air, because air is actually a good insulator. Moving air is terrible. That's wind chill. But still trapped air excellent. So you'd have a bottom layer, maybe a buffalo robe if you were fortunate. Buffalo hide with the fur still on, laid fur down on your mattress. That protected you from the cold rising from the ground beneath your cabin. Then your body. Then wool blankets. Multiple wool blankets layered. Then possibly another buffalo robe or bearskin fur up, this time on top. The weight of all this bedding. It was substantial, like sleeping under a pile of coats. But that weight helped seal out drafts and held everything in place. Some families slept together, not just couples, but the whole family. Multiple people in one bed, children in the middle, parents on the outside taking the colder positions. Body heat shared. This wasn't about comfort. This was physics. Each human body is an 80-watt heater, more or less. 2 bodies generate more warmth than 1. 3 is better still. In the extreme cold, families would even bring newborn livestock inside. A calf, a lamb, even piglets. Not for sentiment, though surely they developed attachments, but because losing a newborn meant losing next year's income. And honestly, the animal's body heat helped too. There's a recorded case of a family that brought their milk cow into their sod house for the worst weeks of February 1887. The cow lived in the corner and they mucked out the manure once a day. Was it pleasant? No. But that cow's body heat, roughly 2,000 watts of biological heating, probably saved their lives. And in spring, they had a cow. Their neighbors who left theirs outside. They had a frozen carcass, now sleeping itself. Your body temperature naturally drops slightly when you sleep. That's normal. But in these conditions, dropping too much is dangerous. So, someone needed to stay partially alert to tend the fire. Many families developed a rotation. Father takes first watch, oldest son, second mother, third. Each person sleeping in shifts of 3 or 4 hours. If you were alone, and many people were, especially men, on homestead claims trying to prove up their land, you had a choice. Sleep lightly, waking every few hours naturally to feed the fire. Or, and this is what some did, bank the fire before bed. Banking a fire is an art. You don't just pile on wood and hope for the best. You'd rake your coals into a concentrated mound. Then you'd cover them, partially, not completely, with ash. The ash insulates the coals, slowing their burn. Then you'd place large pieces of wood on top, the largest you had. And if you did it just right, those coals would stay alive all night, and in the morning you could uncover them. Add kindling and have a fire going again in minutes rather than having to start from scratch. Starting a fire from scratch in winter was miserable. Your matches were unreliable. Matches of that era were phosphorus matches, and they didn't always light. And even when they did, your hands were so cold you could barely feel them, barely manipulate the tiny stick. People learned to always keep their match supply near the stove where it was dry and warmish. Some people kept a coal going all winter, literally, never let it go out from November to March. That coal, that continuity of fire, was life. Losing it meant potentially deadly minutes of cold while you struggled to relight. The darkness at night was total. Your candle, if you had one burning, created a tiny sphere of light, maybe 6 feet across. Beyond that, nothing, just black. The kind of darkness that city dwellers today simply never experience. And in that darkness, sounds were amplified. Every creak, every snap, every strange noise became potentially significant. Was that the wind? Or was something wrong? Was that the cabin settling? Or was a beam breaking under the weight of snow on the roof? People developed acute hearing. They could tell by the sound of the wind what direction it was coming from and roughly how fast it was blowing. They could hear the difference between snow falling and sleet. They could tell by the quality of the silence whether it was about to start snowing or if clear cold was settling in. Sleep then was light, interrupted, never truly restful. You'd drift into dreams, but the cold would pull you back. You'd dream of warmth of summer, of being somewhere else. And then you'd wake to darkness and cold and the necessity of adding wood to the fire. Morning came, but as I said, morning is a relative term when the sun barely clears the horizon and it's dark by 4 in the afternoon. You'd wake in darkness. Lie there for a moment, gathering courage to leave your cocoon. Then the day would start again. But here's what's remarkable. People adapted. Human beings are astonishingly adaptable. What seemed impossible in November became routine by January. Your body learned to function on less. Less food, less warmth, less sleep, less light. You became efficient, conserved energy, moved with purpose. There's a term from psychology, hedonic adaptation. It means we get used to our circumstances, whether good or bad, and they become our new normal. These people got used to being cold, not comfortable. They never became comfortable, but used to it. They developed a resilience, a toughness that our modern, comfortable selves can barely imagine. Children born in these conditions, they never knew anything else. This was just how the world was. Cold, dark, requiring constant vigilance, and they grew up with that hardiness in their bones. There are stories of children who would go outside to play in weather that would kill an unprepared adult. Not because they were immune to cold. They weren't. But because they'd learned how to be in it. How to recognize the warning signs in their own bodies. When fingers started to lose feeling, get inside and warm them. Don't wait. Don't push it. Respect the cold. And at night, these children would sleep like puppies in a pile, unconsciously sharing warmth their young metabolisms, burning through calories, but also generating the heat that kept them alive. The sounds of sleep in a winter cabin would have been distinctive. Breathing, of course, but also coughing. The cold air, the smoke from the fire, the dust from the sod walls. It all irritated lungs. People had chronic coughs all winter, nothing serious enough to seek help for. There was no help to seek anyway, just a constant reminder that you were breathing challenging air, snoring. In the close quarters, everyone's sleep affected everyone else's, but complaining about it seemed petty in the face of larger concerns. And the creaking. The entire cabin creaking and groaning as frozen wood contracted, as the earth beneath shifted, as snow accumulated on the roof. Sometimes a crack so loud it would wake everyone, hearts pounding, thinking something had broken catastrophically. Then the realization, just the cold, just the building settling, back to sleep. In the morning, frost would coat the underside of the roof. Your breath, your bodies created moisture. That moisture rose, hit the frozen ceiling, and crystallized. Beautiful, actually. Delicate fern patterns of ice. But it also meant you'd wake up with ice crystals raining down on you whenever someone moved too roughly and dislodged it. Some people tacked up canvas or muslin under the roof to catch this frozen condensation. But canvas and muslin were expensive, and not everyone had it. So you learned to sleep with your head under the covers. Breathe into your blankets. Keep your face warm that way, even if it meant breathing recycled air. The first person up in the morning had the worst job, leaving the relative warmth of the bedding, stirring the banked coals, blowing gently to encourage a flame, adding kindling, waiting for it to catch. The cabin so cold you could see your breath like fog, your fingers numb, clumsy. The minutes until the fire really got going felt like hours. But then, warmth, slowly spreading. The stove beginning to radiate heat. The cabin temperature rising from 35 to 40 to 45 degrees. Never comfortable by modern standards. But enough. Survivable. And after weeks of this, enough became plenty. You learned to be grateful for 40 degrees. Breakfast would be simple. Maybe leftover beans from yesterday warmed up. Maybe cornmeal mush. Maybe just coffee and a piece of hardtack bread. Food was fuel. Pleasure was secondary. You ate to have the energy to make it through another day, to generate the body heat, to survive another night. And then, the day. The endless work of winter survival. Checking on livestock. Hauling water, which meant breaking ice on whatever water source you had, whether that was a creek or a barrel. Gathering fuel. Repairing things that broke. trying to keep up with maintenance even though the cold made everything harder. Metal became brittle in extreme cold. A hammer could shatter like glass. Wood became hard as iron, nearly impossible to chop. Leather dried out and cracked. Rope became stiff and refused to knot. Every simple task became a struggle. But you did it, because you had to, because giving up meant dying. And so you persevered, day after day, night after night, and slowly, imperceptibly. At first, you were transformed. Your body, your mind, your spirit. You became harder, more resilient, more appreciative of small warmths, small mercies, small victories. You survived the brutal cold in the Wild West, not because you were superhuman, but because you became something more than you'd been. You adapted. You endured. You found strength you didn't know you had. And at night, when you finally lay down again under your pile of blankets and buffalo robes, when you let yourself relax into whatever rest you could find, there was a satisfaction, a primal, deep satisfaction. You were alive. You'd made it through another day. The cold hadn't beaten you. Not yet. Not tonight. Let's let that feeling wash over you now. That profound gratitude for warmth, for safety, for survival. As you lie in your comfortable bed in your climate-controlled room, feel the echo of what those people felt. The relief, the exhaustion, the triumph of simply existing through hardship. And let's drift now into the daily rhythms of this frozen world. The routines that structured survival. Evening tasks in a winter cabin followed a rhythm as precise as any dance. Nothing was wasted. Not time, not motion, not energy, not heat. Everything had its place and its time, because efficiency wasn't a luxury. It was survival. As afternoon darkness came, and it came early by 4 or 4:30 in midwinter, you'd begin your evening preparations. First priority securing the livestock. If you had a barn, and many people didn't, just a rough lean-to or dugout shelter, you'd need to make sure your animals were as protected as possible. The milk cow, essential for survival, got the best spot. She needed to stay alive and healthy enough to produce milk. That milk was often the difference between malnutrition and adequate nutrition, especially for children. You'd check her water. This meant breaking ice. A milk cow needs to drink cold weather or not. You'd break the ice on her water bucket with whatever you had. An axe, a hammer, a heavy stick. And you'd do it multiple times a day because the water froze again within hours. Her feed. If you'd managed to put up hay, and if the summer drought hadn't ruined your hay crop, you'd give her what you could spare. But hay was precious. You had to calculate. Too much, and you'd run out before spring. Too little, and she'd weaken, stop producing milk, possibly die. It was a terrible calculus. The chickens, if you had chickens, were surprisingly hardy. Chickens can survive remarkable cold if they're dry and out of the wind. But they need food. They won't forage in snow. So you'd scatter grain, corn, wheat, whatever you had. And in return, they'd give you eggs. Maybe not many in the dead of winter, but some. And those eggs were gold. Protein, fat, nutrition in a perfect little package. The workhorse if you had one. In summer, he'd be in the fields ploughing, hauling. In winter, he was mostly idle, but he still needed care, still needed to be fed and watered. And you needed him to survive, because come spring, you'd need him again. A farmer without a horse was in desperate shape. Some families had pigs. Pigs were food on the hoof, but pigs also needed constant feeding, and they weren't adapted to cold like cattle. Keeping a pig alive through this winter was a challenge. Many families slaughtered their pigs early in late fall and preserved the meat because trying to keep them alive wasn't worth the feed cost. Once the animals were secured, and this might take an hour or more of work in brutal cold, you'd gather your evening fuel supply. You couldn't go out in the middle of the night to get more wood or hay. Too dangerous in the dark and cold. So you'd bring in enough to last until morning. This meant multiple trips, arms loaded with twisted haycats or with split wood or with buffalo chips. Your fuel pile inside the cabin had to be maintained at a certain level. Too low, and you'd risk running out in the night. Too high, and you'd be wasting space in your already cramped quarters. Water for the night. This was critical. You'd bring in water, either melted snow or water hauled from a creek before it froze solid. You'd need water for drinking, for cooking breakfast, for washing minimally. Melting snow takes fuel and time. Snow is mostly air, so it takes a shocking amount of snow to yield a little water. And the water has to be melted carefully, because if you just put snow in a pot on a hot stove, it scorches the pot and ruins the water. Evening meal preparation. This was the main hot meal of the day. Breakfast was quick. Lunch might not exist at all. But evening, you'd try to have something substantial. Beans. Oh, the beans. Dried navy beans or pinto beans cooked until they were soft. You'd cook a big pot at the beginning of the week and then reheat portions each night. Beans with salt pork if you had it. Just beans if you didn't. They were cheap, stored well, and provided decent protein and calories. Cornbread. If you had cornmeal and some grease, you could make cornbread, baked in a cast iron skillet, either on top of the stove or if your stove had an oven inside it. Cornbread was filling. It stuck with you, gave you something to sop up the bean juice. Meat occasionally. If you'd been able to slaughter a steer in the fall and you'd hung the carcass in an unheated outbuilding where it would freeze solid, you could cut off chunks as needed. But cutting frozen meat was hard work. It required a saw sometimes, and then it had to thaw and cook, which took time and fuel. Or maybe you'd manage to hunt. A deer if you were lucky and skilled. Prairie chickens, rabbits. Any meat was precious. Any fat even more so. Fat has more than twice the calories per gram as protein or carbohydrate. Your body craves fat in cold weather because it's so efficient as fuel. The evening meal was eaten in relative silence usually. People were tired. Conversation took energy. Better to just eat. Absorb the warmth of the food, let it fuel your internal furnace. After eating came the small tasks. Mending. Always something to mend. A tear in a coat, a hole in a sock. You couldn't afford to throw anything away. Every piece of fabric had value. Women especially spent countless hours sewing by firelight or candlelight. Fingers working, keeping things functional. Men might work on tools, sharpening a knife, fixing a harness, crafting something from wood. Idle hands in the long winter evenings were a psychological danger as much as anything. Keeping busy kept your mind from dark places. Children, if you had children, needed attention, needed teaching. Many families did lessons in the evening, reading, writing, arithmetic. The famous Little Red Schoolhouse of American mythology was often closed in winter. Roads were impassable, weather too dangerous. So education happened at home, parents teaching children by firelight. And stories. Stories were entertainment, education, and psychological survival all wrapped together. Parents would tell stories from the old country, from their own childhood, making their children understand where they'd come from. stories from the Bible, fairy tales, stories made up on the spot, the oral tradition alive and well on the frozen frontier. Some families sang hymns, folk songs, lullabies, music that connected them to something beyond the cold and dark. Music that reminded them they were human, not just survival machines. And eventually, sleep preparations, banking the fire as carefully as possible, making sure the door was secured. Some people piled snow against the door as extra insulation, checking that everyone had adequate bedding. Then the final trip outside if necessary, to the outhouse, which was its own special misery that we don't need to dwell on except to say that it was perhaps the worst moment of any day. And then, finally, to bed. The same ritual as the night before. The same cold sheets until your body heat warmed them. The same weight of blankets. The same sounds of the cabin and wind and family. And sleep. That fragmented, never quite adequate sleep. Until the cycle began again. This was life. This was normal. Week after week, month after month. The winter that refused to end. But let me tell you about something that sustained people through all of this. Something harder to quantify than food, or fuel, or shelter, but just as important. Community, connection, the knowledge that they weren't alone in this struggle. There's a phenomenon that settlers on the Great Plains came to know well, though they didn't have a name for it. Later generations would call it prairie madness or cabin fever. But those terms don't quite capture the experience. It was something deeper, a slow erosion of the spirit under the weight of isolation, darkness, and unrelenting cold. Imagine it. You're in your small cabin, the same four walls day after day, the same people, or maybe you're alone, which is worse. The same limited food, the same cold, the same dark. No escape, no relief, no end in sight. The darkness itself was oppressive. Not just the absence of light, but the presence of dark. It pressed against you. In December and January at these latitudes, you might get 8, maybe 9 hours of weak daylight. Weak because the sun barely climbed above the horizon. It was always dawn or dusk, never full day. And the rest? 16 hours of darkness. 16 hours every single day of confined night. Human beings aren't wired for this. We're adaptable, yes, but we're also biological creatures with circadian rhythms that depend on light cycles. When those rhythms are disrupted for months on end, psychological effects inevitably follow. Depression was common. Not the clinical diagnosis we understand today, but a deep melancholy. A sense that life had lost its color and meaning. That you were just going through the motions, surviving, but not living. Women seemed particularly vulnerable, possibly because they were more confined to the cabin, while men at least had outdoor work to do. There are recorded cases of women who stopped speaking. Just stopped. They'd perform their tasks mechanically, but wouldn't talk, wouldn't engage, had retreated somewhere inside themselves where the winter couldn't reach. Sometimes they came back when spring arrived. Sometimes they didn't. Anxiety too. The constant low-level fear. Will we have enough food? Will the fuel last? Will the roof hold? Is that cough my child has something serious? Will the cattle survive? Each question gnawing away, and no way to get answers. No way to check. Just wait, and hope, and worry. The wind. I keep coming back to the wind because it was such a psychological presence. That constant sound. Sometimes low and moaning, sometimes high and shrieking, but never truly silent. It wore on you, scraped at your nerves like fingernails on slate. People reported that after weeks of the sound, they'd find themselves clenching their jaw without realizing it, tensing their shoulders, the wind's presence in their bodies, even when they were trying to rest. And the dreams. Oh, the dreams people had. Intense, vivid dreams. Sometimes of warmth and plenty. Sometimes nightmares of freezing, of being lost in endless white. Dreams of summer that were so real you'd wake up shocked to find yourself still in winter darkness. The disappointment of that could be crushing. But, and this is important, people also found ways to fight back against the dark. Small rebellions, small assertions of humanity against the void. Reading. I mentioned this before, but let me expand. Those who could read and who had books treasured them beyond measure. Reading transported you out of that cabin, out of that winter, into other worlds. Even if you'd read the same book 10 times before it was an escape. Writing. Letters to family back east, even though they might not get mailed until spring. Diaries. Some of our best historical records of this period come from people who chronicled their days. Not because they thought anyone would care, but because the act of writing, of putting experience into words, made it feel more manageable. Transformed it from raw suffering into narrative, prayer. Many settlers were deeply religious. Prayer gave structure to the day. Morning prayers, evening prayers, grace before meals. It connected them to something larger than their immediate circumstances. And for some, it was a genuine comfort. A sense that God saw them, knew their struggle would deliver them through to spring. Others found their faith tested. How could a loving God allow such suffering, allow cattle to freeze, children to go hungry, good people to die? The theodicy problem lived out in stark reality. Some people's faith broke, others found it strengthened, tempered like steel by hardship. Talking, really talking. Not just about tasks and necessities, but about thoughts, feelings, fears, hopes. Couples who survived the winter together reported either growing much closer or much more distant. There was no middle ground. The forced intimacy either bonded you or revealed incompatibilities that couldn't be ignored. Humor helped, dark humor often. Jokes about the cold, about the wind. Gallows humor about death and suffering. It sounds grim, but laughter, even bitter laughter, was a release. A way of saying, we're still humans, still capable of finding absurdity in this. Children played. Even in the confined space, children found ways to play. Simple games, rag dolls, toy soldiers made from sticks. Their resilience, their ability to find joy in tiny things often kept parents going. If the children can still laugh, then it's not hopeless. Some people developed elaborate routines, specific tasks done in specific order at specific times. The routine itself became comforting. Predictability in the face of chaos, control over something, anything, when so much was beyond control. And there was occasional respite. On days when the weather broke, when the wind died and the sun came out, and the temperature rose to, say, 0 degrees, which felt downright balmy. People would emerge. They'd visit neighbors, if possible, check on each other, share news, share food, share company. These visits were lifelines, literally. Families kept track of who they'd seen and when. If you hadn't seen someone in a week, you'd go check on them, weather permitting. Because isolation killed, sometimes directly. Someone getting sick or injured with no one to help. Sometimes indirectly. The despair, the giving up. There are stories of neighbors finding each other just in time. A family that had run out of food was down to their last few pounds of flour, too proud to ask for help. Neighbors arriving with supplies, saved not just from starvation, but from the despair that came from believing no one cared, no one knew, no one was coming. The social fabric of the frontier, often portrayed as individualistic and independent, was actually deeply interdependent. People survived the brutal cold in the Wild West, not alone, but together, checking on each other, sharing when you had, accepting help when you didn't, knowing that today you were the helper, tomorrow you might need help. It was an economy of mutual aid, born of absolute necessity. And as the winter wore on, as January became February, people started to watch for signs. Signs that spring might eventually come. It seemed impossible, but it had to, didn't it? The angle of the sun. Even in the worst cold, someone would notice that the sun was setting a few minutes later this week than last week. That tiny difference mattered enormously. It meant the earth was still turning. Seasons were still cycling. Spring wasn't just a memory or a hope. It was coming. Slowly, but coming. Animal behavior. The first crow seen after weeks of absence. A magpie. Even these scavengers returning meant something was shifting. Or cattle, if any were still alive, starting to move more, sensing something. And then eventually, the first Chinook wind. If you don't know what a Chinook is, it's a warm wind that can come down off the Rockies, raising temperatures 40 or 50 degrees in a matter of hours. One day, it's 20 below. The next day, it's 30 above. Snow starts to melt. Water drips. The air smells different. Chinooks were temporary. The cold would come back. But they were proof that winter wasn't absolute. That the ice would break. That the frozen earth would thaw. And so people held on. Through January. Through February. Into March, which could still be brutal. Held on to the belief, the promise, the certainty that winter ends. Always. Always ends. Even this winter. Even the winter of 1886 to 87, which would go down in history as the worst. Even it would end. Eventually. But let me tell you what people found. What historians found when they studied this period. People who survived this winter came out changed. Not broken. Or not all of them anyway. Many came out stronger, with a confidence that if they could survive, that they could survive anything. And they did. They built communities, they built towns, they turned the Great Plains from a frontier into farmland, into civilization. The winter tested them. Many failed the test. But those who passed, they carried that knowledge with them for the rest of their lives. I survived the great die-up. That meant something. So as you lie there now, warm and safe, think about that. Think about the psychological strength it took. Not just the physical hardships. Those are easier to understand. But the mental fortitude, the emotional resilience, the spiritual endurance, and take from it what you will. Maybe a sense of gratitude for modern comforts. Maybe a sense of awe at human capability. Maybe just a story to carry with you. But let it ground you. Let it remind you that hardship, when faced with courage and community, can be survived. That darkness ends. That winter, no matter how long, eventually gives way to spring. Now, let me take you deeper into the history of this, into the cultural context that shaped how people survived. To truly understand what happened in the winter of 1886 to 87, we need to step back. We need to see the bigger picture. Because this wasn't just a bad winter. It was the catastrophic end of an entire era. The death of something called The open range. In the years after the Civil War, the Great Plains had transformed into what newspapers called the beef bonanza, or the cattle kingdom. It seemed like alchemy, like you could turn grass into gold. Here's how it worked. Texas, after the war, was overrun with wild cattle, descendants of Spanish livestock. These longhorns had bred freely for years during the war when there was no one to tend them. You could gather them essentially for free. They were worth maybe $3–4 a head in Texas, but in Chicago, in New York, $30–40 or more. The problem was getting them there. But then came the railroads pushing west, and suddenly you had a route. Drive cattle north from Texas to railroad towns in Kansas, Abilene, Dodge City, load them on trains, ship them east, profit. This was the heyday of the cowboy, the trail drives, the Long Branch Saloon, all the mythology. But it lasted maybe 20 years, a single generation. Then someone had an idea. Why drive cattle all the way from Texas? Why not keep them in the north? The grass up on the northern plains, Montana, Wyoming, Dakota Territory, was thick and lush, thousands of square miles of it, hardly any people. Indigenous tribes had been forced onto reservations, buffalo nearly exterminated. The land was open, so ranchers started moving cattle onto the northern plains and just leaving them, turning them loose. Open range ranching, they called it. You'd brand your cattle so you could identify them, but then they'd just roam free, mixing with your neighbor's cattle, grazing on public land. In the fall, you'd have a roundup, separate out your cattle by brand, take them to market. It was cheap, minimal labor cost, no feed cost. The cattle ate grass that belonged to no one, or rather to the government, or rather to everyone and no one. No shelter cost. They lived outside year-round. Just a few cowboys to watch over vast herds. And for a few years, it worked beautifully. Cattle thrived. Profits were enormous. Investors back east in England and Scotland formed cattle companies, syndicates. They poured money and bought vast herds, expected huge returns. Granville Stewart, one of the biggest ranchers in Montana, described it as beef mining. You just extracted wealth from the land without putting anything back. It seemed sustainable because the resource, grass, regenerated every year. But there were problems. Problems that should have been obvious, but that greed blinded people to. First, overstocking. When every rancher is trying to maximize their own profit and everyone is using the same open range, what happens? Everyone puts out as many cattle as possible. More cattle than the land can sustainably support. It's the tragedy of the commons playing out in real time. By 1886, estimates suggest there were more than 1 million cattle on the northern plains. Maybe a lot more. Record keeping was haphazard. Wherever cowboys went to gather their herds, they found cattle. Everywhere cattle. The range was absolutely packed. Second drought. The summer of 1886 was dry. Streams that usually ran year-round dried up. Waterholes became mudholes. And the grass, the all-important grass, didn't grow well. It was sparse, short, poor quality. Cattle went into that winter already weak, already thin. Not the fat, healthy animals that can survive cold weather, but stressed animals with depleted fat reserves. Third, and this is key, no one prepared. The entire business model was based on not spending money on infrastructure. No barns, no stored hay, nothing. The cattle were on their own. They'd survived previous winters, so they'd survive this one right. Some old-timers tried to warn people. Native Americans who'd lived on these plains for generations saw the signs and knew what was coming. The early bird migration, the thick fur on wild animals, the way the wind smelled. They tried to tell settlers bad winter coming. But settlers dismissed this as superstition, as primitive people not understanding modern ranching. That was a deadly mistake. Then came the killing cold, the winter that wouldn't end. It started in November with those early storms we discussed. By December, it was clear this wasn't normal. By January, it was catastrophic. And still, it didn't let up. The temperature. Let me give you some numbers, because numbers make it real. At Fort Keogh in Montana, the thermometer hit 46 below zero. That's 46 degrees Fahrenheit below zero. Negative 46 in modern wind chill terms, which they didn't calculate then, but which we can estimate. It would have felt like 70 or 80 below. At that temperature, cattle don't just suffer. They die. Their bodies can't generate enough heat to survive. Their extremities freeze. Ears, tails, udders. Then they succumb to hypothermia, and they just stop. The snow. 16 inches fell in a single 16-hour period during one January storm. Then it would melt slightly, then freeze into a crust, then more snow on top. Layer after layer. In some coulees, those shallow valleys that crease the plains, drifts reached 20-30 feet deep. And the wind, sustained high winds for days at a time. Wind that drove the cold through any shelter. Wind that pushed cattle before it like tumbleweed. The cattle, driven by instinct, turned their backs to the wind and walked south. Always south, away from the wind. This is called drifting, and it's natural behavior. In a normal winter, they might drift a few miles, find some shelter, survive. But this winter, they drifted until they hit obstacles. And that's where the great tragedy happened. The barbed wire fences. Barbed wire was relatively new technology. Patented in 1874 by the 1880s, it was everywhere. Ranchers used it to define their territory, to control access to water, to keep cattle from drifting off their range. But cattle don't know about property lines. When a storm hits and their instinct says, move, they move. And when they encounter a fence, they don't understand it. They just press against it. And more cattle come from behind. And more. Until there are hundreds, thousands packed against miles of fence line. And then they die. In the cold, standing up, pressed together. They freeze into a solid mass. The ones in the middle can't even fall down. They're held upright by the pressure of bodies around them. When spring finally came, cowboys sent out to assess the damage found these scenes repeated over and over. Miles of fence line with cattle carcasses piled against them. The horror of it shook even the hardest men. Theodore Roosevelt, who wasn't yet president but was a young rancher in the Dakota Badlands, lost between 60 and 75% of his herd. He wrote to a friend, "I am bluer than indigo about the cattle. It is even worse than I feared." But Roosevelt was actually one of the lucky ones. He had some reserves, some money from his family back east. He could absorb the loss, though it hurt. Many ranchers were completely wiped out. 100% loss. From wealthy to bankrupt in a single winter. The cattle companies, those syndicates that had promised investors huge returns, collapsed. Some literally just walked away, abandoned their claims, left the mess for someone else to deal with. The economic ripple effects were enormous. Banks that had loaned money against cattle as collateral suddenly had no collateral. They failed. Towns that depended on the cattle trade dried up. Workers lost their jobs. But something else happened too, something more profound. The fundamental business model changed. Ranchers realized they couldn't treat cattle like wild animals anymore. They needed infrastructure, barns for shelter, hay put up in summer to feed in winter, smaller herds that could actually be cared for. It was the end of open-range ranching and the beginning of what we might call scientific ranching. Fences went up everywhere. Not drift fences meant to stop cattle, but boundary fences to define private property. The open range closed. The cowboy era, the real cowboy era, not the Hollywood version, ended. And the settlers, the ones we've been talking about all night, the ones surviving in their sod houses, they inherited a changed landscape. The big cattle barons lost their power. Smaller operations became viable. Homesteading increased. The frontier began to close. From the ashes of that terrible winter, from the carcasses of 1 million dead cattle, a new West was born. More settled, more stable, less romantic perhaps, but more sustainable. The people who survived, they remembered. Before the die-up and after the die-up became markers of time, a dividing line in history. And they told their children, and their children told their children about the winter when the cold revealed the fundamental truth that nature was not to be trifled with. That there's no such thing as free wealth. That sustainability matters. These are lessons that feel relevant even today, don't they? The idea that you can't just extract without consequence, that you need to prepare for worst-case scenarios, not just hope for the best. That traditional knowledge, like what native peoples tried to share, often has real value. But let's turn now to those native peoples, because their story in this winter is important too, and in many ways it's a different story than the settlers. While settlers struggled in their sod houses and cattle froze by the thousands, the indigenous peoples of the Great Plains, the Lakota, Cheyenne, Crow, Blackfeet and others, were also facing this brutal winter. But their experience was different in important ways. First, understand that by 1886, most Plains tribes had already been confined to reservations. Their traditional way of life, following the buffalo herds in seasonal migrations, had been destroyed. The buffalo were essentially gone exterminated deliberately as a strategy to force native peoples onto reservations. Without buffalo, they couldn't sustain their traditional lifestyle. So they were already in crisis before the winter even started, living on government rations that were often inadequate and of poor quality, dependent on an Indian agency system that was corrupt and indifferent to their suffering. But, and this is fascinating, even in these constrained circumstances, they survived that winter better than many settler populations. Not comfortably, not without hardship and loss. But their survival strategies were more effective. Why? Generations of accumulated knowledge about living on the plains. Let's start with shelter, a teepee. The conical hide tent that nomadic plains tribes used is actually a brilliant piece of engineering. The conical shape is aerodynamic. Wind flows around it rather than catching against flat walls. It's stable even in high winds. The poles, when properly set, distribute the weight and tension evenly. The covering, traditionally buffalo hide, provided insulation. And inside, families used a liner. A separate piece of hide hung about waist height around the interior. This created a dead air space between the outer covering and the inner liner. Dead air, as we've discussed, is insulation. This is the same principle as double-pane windows or insulated jackets. The smoke hole at the top had flaps that could be adjusted to control draft and let smoke out while keeping wind from blowing in. The doorway faced east traditionally, which on the plains usually meant away from the prevailing winds. Inside a teepee with a fire burning, temperatures could be remarkably warm. Not comfortable by modern standards, but above freezing, maybe 40–50 degrees, which compared to the temperature outside was life-saving. And here's something remarkable. A teepee could be heated more efficiently than a sod house. Why? Because it was smaller, had less air volume, and the conical shape meant heat rose to the peak, but then radiated back down. The smoke hole could be partially closed to retain more heat. Tribes that still had access to buffalo hides were better off than those who didn't. Buffalo hide is thick, dense, naturally water-resistant. It's better insulation than canvas or thin deerskin. But even beyond shelter, native peoples had knowledge about cold weather survival that settlers didn't. Clothing. Plains Indians wore layered clothing made from tanned hides. Deerskin shirts, leggings, moccasins. Over that, in winter, buffalo robes. The hide would be worn fur-in, creating that same dead airspace against the body. A buffalo robe properly made and worn is one of the warmest garments ever created. Footwear is interesting. Moccasins seem like they'd be cold right, thin leather soles. But they were worn with care. You'd stuff them with dried grass or rabbit fur for insulation, and you'd wear multiple pairs of socks. Wool, if you could get it from traders, or socks made from animal fur. Food preparation. One of the most important survival foods on the plains was pemmican. This is a native invention that sustained people through countless winters. Pemmican is made from dried meat, buffalo or deer or whatever you have, pounded into powder, mixed with rendered fat, usually bear fat or buffalo fat, sometimes with dried berries mixed in for flavor and nutrients, then formed into cakes and stored. Why is this brilliant? Because it's incredibly calorie-dense. A pound of pemmican could sustain a person for days. It doesn't spoil. The fat preserves the meat. It doesn't freeze into a solid block. You can eat it even in the coldest weather without having to thaw it. And it contains both protein and fat in perfect balance for cold weather survival. Settlers who learned to make pemmican from native peoples dramatically improved their survival chances. Those who didn't, who relied on bulky stores of flour and beans that had to be cooked, struggled more. Water sourcing. In deep winter, when streams freeze solid, where do you get water? If you're melting snow, you're using precious fuel and time. But native peoples knew how to find springs that didn't freeze, knew which creek bends would have open water even in the coldest weather, knew how to read the landscape for water signs, and communal living. This is perhaps most important. Plains tribes lived in bands and camps, multiple families together. They shared resources automatically. If one family's food ran low, others shared. If someone was sick, others cared for them. There wasn't the isolated individualism that characterized settler homesteads. This communal approach meant that cold and hardship were borne collectively. No one faced the psychological isolation that drove some settlers to madness. There was always someone to talk to share burden with. Storytelling in the winter lodge wasn't just entertainment. It was education. Elders would tell stories about previous hard winters, about how ancestors survived, about what signs to watch for. This oral tradition transmitted survival knowledge across generations. But, and I need to be clear about this, Even with all this knowledge, even with generations of adaptation, the winter of 1886–87 was hard on native peoples too. Government rations were inadequate to begin with, and in that winter, supply trains couldn't get through. Reservations went weeks without deliveries. People starved. Not as many as would have without their traditional knowledge, but hunger was widespread. The reservation system itself made survival harder. Concentrated populations meant resources nearby were quickly exhausted. Traditionally, bands would disperse for winter, spreading out to reduce pressure on any one area. But reservations didn't allow that. And the cultural suppression that was happening. Children taken to boarding schools, traditional practices forbidden. That was eroding the transmission of survival knowledge. Some younger people didn't know the old ways as well as their parents had. Still, the survival rate among native peoples that winter was higher than among cattle, that's for certain. And probably higher than among recent settlers who hadn't adapted yet. There's a lesson here about respect for traditional ecological knowledge, about how people who live in a place for generations learn things that can't be replicated quickly, about how dismissing primitive people as ignorant is itself ignorant. Some settlers did learn, did adopt native techniques, wore buffalo robes, made pemmican, learned to read weather signs. These were the ones who survived and thrived. The stubborn ones, the ones who insisted European ways were superior, in all respects the ones who refused to adapt. Many of them didn't make it. And there's a broader historical irony here. The same federal government that was trying to civilize native peoples, to make them into farmers, to erase their traditional culture, that government's policies created the conditions for the cattle disaster, encouraging overstocking, failing to regulate the commons, promoting an unsustainable boom. Native peoples, with their traditional practices of sustainable hunting, seasonal migration, and respect for ecological limits, would never have created the conditions for the die-up. They understood in their bones that the land had limits. But they'd been removed from the equation. And without their presence, without their management, the plains ecosystem was thrown off balance. Buffalo gone. Natural fire cycles disrupted. Then cattle overstocking. Then collapse. In the years after 1887, some ranchers began to see this. Began to understand that maybe the people they dismissed as savages actually knew things worth knowing. Cross-cultural learning began to happen slowly. And today, when we talk about sustainable ranching, about grassland management, about respecting ecological limits, we're often rediscovering principles that Plains Indians knew centuries ago. But I don't want to romanticize. Native peoples weren't magical ecological mystics. They were people, practical people who'd learned through trial and error and passed that learning down. The difference was time. They'd had time to learn the land. Settlers hadn't. And that winter, that terrible winter, was nature's way of teaching a harsh lesson about the cost of not learning, about the price of arrogance and greed and haste. So as you lie there drifting towards sleep, think about wisdom. Think about knowledge that comes from experience. Think about the value of learning from people who've been in a place longer than you have. And think about the cold. The brutal cold that doesn't care about your nationality or your race or your beliefs. That tests everyone equally. That respects only preparation and knowledge and adaptation. The cold as teacher. The cold as revealer of truth. The cold that shows who's ready and who isn't. Let that cold touch you now just in imagination. Feel its presence in this story, and then feel the warmth of your actual surroundings. The gift of the present, the luxury of not having to survive, but simply to rest and dream. Just breathe. Let that gratitude fill your chest. Slow in and slow out, relaxing deeper into the mattress, feeling the weight of your own warmth. Before we settle into the sleeping arrangements, I want to share something that defines the human spirit in these times. There's a recorded story of a 12-year-old girl in Dakota Territory who walked 3 miles through a 40-degree blizzard. She went barefoot after her boots froze solid and cracked just to bring medicine to a neighbor's dying baby. And both she and the child survived. 12 years old. Walking through hell for a neighbor. That creates a warmth no fire can match. Now let's come back to something more intimate, more human scale. Because yes, this winter was about big historical forces and economic systems and ecological disaster. But it was also about individual people, individual families, individual moments of connection and loss. Let's return to that cabin. It's deep in the night now. The coldest part, the hours just before dawn when temperatures drop to their lowest. Outside, it might be 50 below. Inside, with the fire carefully tended, it's perhaps 40 degrees. Cold enough to see your breath, but survivable. You're lying in your bed, wrapped in your layers of blankets and hides. And you're not alone. If you're married, your spouse is beside you. And the physical closeness isn't just affection, though it may be that too. It's survival. 2 bodies generate more heat than one. You sleep pressed together, sharing warmth. In the deep of winter, couples who might have had conflicts might have been frustrated with each other in easier times. They put it aside. Because needing each other wasn't abstract. It was literal. And the children. Children sleep close to parents. Or all the children together in one bed, youngest in the middle where it's warmest. Bodies piled like puppies. There's no privacy in a winter cabin. No space for individualism. You survive as a unit, or you don't survive. Sometimes you'd wake in the night and check. Listen to the breathing of your family members. Count them in your mind. All still there, all still alive. And that knowledge would let you settle back into sleep. The fear of cold was always present, but usually manageable. The fear of disease was worse. Because in a 1-room cabin, if one person gets sick, everyone gets sick. And there's no doctor, no medicine beyond whatever home remedies you know. Willow bark tea for pain and fever, honey for coughs if you have honey. Mostly just waiting and hoping the person's body can fight off whatever it is. Pneumonia was a killer. The cold air, the smoke from the fire, the dust from the sod walls, it all irritated lungs. A chest cold could turn into something worse very quickly. Children and elderly were most vulnerable. A bad cough that wouldn't go away, that kept parents awake with worry. But let me tell you about something beautiful that happened in this context. Something that shows the best of human nature. Neighbors checking on neighbors. On days when the weather broke, when it was merely cold instead of lethally cold, people would make the trek to nearby homesteads. Maybe a mile away, maybe 2. They'd follow the fence lines or landmarks they'd memorized, and they'd check. You folks all right? Got enough food? Enough fuel? Anyone sick? And if someone needed help, people helped. Maybe you'd split your own meager supplies. Give them a sack of flour, some coffee. Not because you could spare it. You couldn't really. But because next week you might be the one in need. There are documented cases of families sharing 1 cow through the winter, taking turns having her at their place for milking, She'd produce just enough for both families if managed carefully. This kind of cooperation wasn't charity. It was mutual aid. It was survival strategy, or firewood. If one family had a stand of cottonwoods nearby and another didn't, they'd cut and share. Labor too. If someone was sick or injured and couldn't do their own chores, neighbors would do it. Feed their animals, haul their water, keep them alive until they recovered. This created bonds, deep bonds. People who went through that winter together, who helped each other survive. They were connected for life. They became a family in a way that went beyond blood. And there were parties. Yes, parties. Even in the depths of that terrible winter when people could get together, they celebrated. Maybe someone had managed to shoot a deer. That was cause for a gathering. Everyone would come. They'd feast, by their standards anyway. Venison roasted everyone bringing what they could contribute. And they'd talk, share news, share rumors, stories about who'd lost cattle, who was struggling, who was managing. And they'd dance. Someone would play a fiddle or a harmonica. They'd push the furniture back and they'd dance. Square dances, folk dances. Not gracefully. Everyone was half frozen, stiff-tired. But they'd dance anyway, because dancing was defiance. Dancing was saying, we're still humans, still alive, still capable of joy. Children would play, run around the cabin, finally able to really move and shout. Adults would talk sometimes deep into the night. No one wanted to leave, to go back out into the cold and isolation. They'd linger as long as possible. These gatherings were essential. They combated the cabin fever, the isolation, the depression. They reminded people why they were fighting to survive. For community, for connection, for each other. And news would spread at these gatherings. Who died? Because people did die. An accident, an illness, suicide in a few cases. The isolation and despair becoming too much. And the community would mourn together, would promise to look after the widow or the orphans, would absorb the loss collectively. Spring weddings were planned at winter gatherings. Couples who decided to marry but were waiting for weather that would allow a preacher to travel, or waiting until they could afford some kind of celebration. These engagements gave people something to look forward to, a promise of future, of continuity. Letters were shared. If someone had gotten mail before the roads closed, they'd share news from back east, from the old country. The letter might be read aloud to everyone, and people who couldn't write would dictate responses that someone else would write down and send when possible. The mail was precious beyond measure, a connection to the wider world, proof that somewhere life was going on, that this frozen hell wasn't all there was. And religion. Community religious services when people could gather, not formal church. There often wasn't a church building, but gathering in someone's larger cabin or barn, singing hymns, praying together. For many people, this was crucial. Faith that God saw them, that they weren't forgotten, that this suffering had meaning, or at least would end. Others found their faith tested, as I mentioned before. Why would a loving God allow this? But even doubters often appreciated the community aspect of religion, the gathering, the shared ritual, the structure it provided. And sleep when people finally went home to their own cabins, their own beds. Sleep came easier after human contact. After being reminded you weren't alone in this, that others were fighting the same fight. The order in which families slept was often strategic. Who could afford to sleep deeply and who needed to stay partially alert to tend the fire. Often, it was the father, as the strongest adult, who would take the late-night watch. Mother would take early morning. Older children might take early evening. But sometimes it was whoever was most able on any given night. If someone was sick, they got to sleep through. Others covered. If someone had worked especially hard that day, others let them rest. This flexibility, this mutual care within families was essential. Rigid roles would have broken under the strain. Families that survived were ones that adapted, that worked as teams. And intimacy between couples. This is rarely talked about in historical accounts, but it's worth acknowledging. Sexual intimacy in a one-room cabin with children present. It happened, obviously. Babies continued to be born, but it required creativity and discretion, waiting until children slept deeply, being quiet, quick. Some couples probably went months without intimacy, too cold, too tired, too stressed. But for others, that physical connection was important, a reminder of life, of pleasure, of love amidst hardship. And in the morning, the cycle would begin again. Someone would wake, first stir the fire, start the day. The routine, the endless routine of survival, but fortified by the memory of community, by the knowledge that others were out there fighting their own battles, but connected to you by invisible threads of mutual obligation and care. This is what it meant to survive the brutal cold in the Wild West. Not just physical toughness, though, that was necessary, but social resilience, the ability to maintain human bonds under inhuman pressure. Let's think about that as we drift towards sleep, about the people in your life, the connections that sustain you, the invisible support structure that holds you up. In our modern individualistic culture, we sometimes forget how deeply we depend on each other. But those frontier families, they couldn't forget. Their survival depended on remembering, on maintaining those bonds, on being there for each other. And there's something we can learn from that. Even though we're not facing brutal cold, not facing that kind of physical hardship, we still need each other, still need community, still need to know someone would check on us if we weren't seen for a while. So as you drift off tonight, maybe think about who those people are in your life, who would check on you, who you would check on, the bonds that matter, and be grateful. For warmth, yes. For safety, yes. But also for connection, for love, for not being alone in this human experience. We're in the deep night now, the coldest, darkest hours. But there's something changing. Can you feel it? It's late February, maybe early March. The winter has lasted longer than anyone thought possible. But it's showing signs of breaking. The first sign is so small you'd miss it if you weren't watching carefully. The sun. You've been watching the sun all winter because there was nothing else to watch. The sun is noticeably higher now, rising earlier, setting later, not by much. Minutes. But those minutes add up, and the quality of light is changing. In December and January, the light was thin, grey, weak. Now it's starting to strengthen. Just a little. Just enough to notice. On a clear day, you can feel the sun's warmth on your face. Not enough to truly warm you, but enough to remember what warmth feels like. The snow is starting to compact. Earlier in the winter, each snowfall piled on top of previous snow, building up, burying everything. But now the sun has enough strength that snow settles, compresses. The drifts are still deep, but they're not growing deeper. They've stopped advancing. That's something. And the wind the ever-present soul-crushing wind, it's starting to have breaks. Days when it drops to almost nothing. The silence then is profound, but it's different than winter silence. It's waiting, expectant. Something is coming. The cattle, those that survived, and it's far fewer than anyone hoped. They're starting to move more. You can see it if you go out. They're not just standing with their backs to the wind anymore. They're pawing at snow looking for grass underneath. Instinct telling them that food is coming. Life is coming. And then one day, maybe mid-March, it happens. The Chinook wind. You wake up and something is different. The air smells different, feels different. And when you step outside, the wind that hits your face, it's warm, not cold. Warm. Maybe 40 degrees, maybe 50. After months of below zero, this feels tropical, miraculous. Within hours, the snow is melting, water running everywhere, icicles dripping, the sound of water. You haven't heard running water in 4 months, and suddenly it's everywhere, dripping off roofs, running in rivulets, the beginning of the thaw. The Chinook might last a day, maybe 2. Then cold will return. This isn't spring yet, just spring's promise, spring's warning shot. I'm coming. Hold on. I'm coming. But that brief taste is enough. It reminds you what you were surviving for. It proves that winter, even this winter, isn't eternal. People emerge from their cabins like bears from hibernation, blinking in the light, moving stiffly, but moving, checking on neighbors, assessing damage, counting survivors. And the count is grim, so grim. The cattle, riders go out to assess. What they find is heartbreaking. Carcasses everywhere, in the coulees drifted in with snow, along fence lines piled in frozen masses, in creek beds, on hilltops, everywhere. Estimates will later put the loss at 60 to 90% of all cattle on the northern plains, hundreds of thousands of animals. The economic value, millions of dollars. But beyond that, the end of an entire way of life. Some ranchers ride out, see the devastation, and just keep riding. Leave, can't face it. Others stay, start the grim work of rebuilding, of figuring out how to move forward. The smell as things thaw is indescribable, the stench of death on a massive scale. Coyotes and wolves and bears will feast for weeks, eagles and crows, nature reclaiming what winter killed. But humans survived. Not all. There were deaths, especially among recent immigrants who didn't know the land, who weren't prepared, who didn't have community support. But most made it. Cold, hungry, shaken, but alive. And as March turns to April, as the thaw really begins, as mud season arrives, people start to assess, start to plan. What now? Some leave, pack what they can and go back east, back to cities where you don't have to fight nature for survival, back to places where winter is an inconvenience, not a life-threatening emergency. They tried, they fought, but they're done. Others stay, dig in, double down. They've invested too much to leave. And now, with the cattle kings bankrupt, with land available, with opportunities opening up, maybe this could work. Maybe they could build something here. And slowly, painfully, the plains come back to life. Grass grows. Impossibly, wonderfully, grass grows. The same grass that was buried under feet of snow that you thought might be dead forever. It grows. Green pushes up through brown. Life asserts itself. Wildflowers bloom. In May and June, the plains explode with color. Purple lupine, yellow black-eyed Susans, red Indian paintbrush. Beauty beyond description after months of white and gray and brown. People stop and stare. Some weep. The contrast is too much. Death and life, winter and spring, despair and hope, calves are born, the few cattle that survived. They calve. Weak calves, many of them. Some don't make it, but some do. And each surviving calf represents hope, represents future, represents the possibility that this gamble might still pay off. Seeds go into ground. Corn, wheat, oats, potatoes, gardens. Farmers plant with a fervor bordering on desperation. They need these crops, need them to survive next winter. Because there will be a next winter. There's always a next winter. But people are wiser now. They've learned. They put up more hay, build better shelters, prepare differently. The lesson has been learned, written in snow and death and suffering. And life goes on. Because that's what life does. It goes on. Through hardship, through disaster, through winters that seem endless. Communities strengthen. The bonds forged in that terrible winter don't fade. People remember who helped them, who shared, who cared, and they help in return. Towns grow, schools are built, churches, general stores, all the infrastructure of civilization slowly spreading across the plains. Not conquering nature. That winter proved you don't conquer nature, but learning to live with it, learning its rhythms and respecting its power. And years later, decades later, when old people gather and talk about the past, they always mention the winter of '86. It becomes legendary, a measuring stick. That was bad, but not as bad as '86. I remember '86. Now that was cold. It becomes part of identity, part of heritage. My grandmother survived '86. She was tough as nails, a source of pride, of connection to something bigger than individual experience. Because that's what we do with hardship, isn't it? We survive it. We process it. We integrate it into our story, and it becomes part of who we are. So tonight, as you lie in your warm bed, in your safe room with spring, or summer, or fall, or even winter, outside your window, but not threatening your survival. Tonight, you can appreciate what you have. The warmth, the safety, the comfort, but also the continuity. The fact that you're connected to all those people who survived all those winters, their blood, their genes, their lessons passed down to you. You're the descendant of survivors, of people who faced brutal cold in the Wild West and made it through. And that's worth something. That's worth knowing. As you drift towards sleep now, let your breathing slow. Let your body relax completely into your mattress. Feel the weight of your blankets, but know they're enough, more than enough. Feel the temperature of your room and know it's safe. You're safe. Let the story settle in your mind. Let the images fade. The frozen plains, the struggling cattle, the isolated cabins. Let them recede into history where they belong. And let yourself appreciate this moment, this quiet, peaceful, safe moment. This gift of not having to struggle, of just being able to rest. Tomorrow will come. But tonight, right now, you're exactly where you need to be. Warm, safe, connected to history, but not trapped in it. Free to dream, free to sleep. And sleep will come. Easy, natural. Your body knowing it's safe. Your mind calm. Drifting down, down into rest, into dreams, into that peaceful place where nothing threatens you. The stories live on. The people who survived the brutal cold in the Wild West, they live on through us, through their descendants, through the lessons they learned and passed down, through the communities they built, through the perseverance they modeled. But their struggle is over. Your struggle for tonight is over. There's nothing you need to do, nowhere you need to be, nothing to prove. Just rest, just sleep. Feel yourself sinking deeper into comfort, into warmth, into safety. The cold outside, If there is cold outside, it can't reach you. The winter of 1886 is more than a century past. You're here, you're now, you're safe. And as you drift, as sleep takes you, know that spring always comes. Always. Winter never lasts forever. The hard times pass. The cold breaks. Life returns. That's the promise. That's the truth. That's what those survivors knew, and what we can know too. Winter ends. Spring comes. Life goes on. And tonight, you can simply rest in that knowledge. Rest in that peace. Rest in that absolute certainty that you're going to be okay. Better than okay. You're going to be fine. So sleep now. Deep sleep. Restful sleep. The kind of sleep that heals and renews and prepares you for whatever tomorrow brings. The brutal cold is just a story now. Just history. Just a tale to carry with you as you drift down, down, down into sleep, into dreams of spring, of warmth, of new beginnings. Sleep well. Sleep deep. Sleep peacefully. You've survived. You're surviving. You'll continue to survive. And that's enough. That's everything. Good night. Thank you for joining me on this journey tonight, for walking with me through that frozen world, for experiencing, even in imagination, what it meant to survive the brutal cold in the Wild West. I hope you found something here. Maybe just a good story to carry you into sleep. Maybe some perspective on your own life. Maybe a sense of connection to those who came before us. If you enjoyed tonight's journey, I'd be grateful if you'd like this video and subscribe to the channel. And please, leave a comment. Where are you listening from? What time is it in your corner of the world? I love knowing we're all connected this way across distances and time zones. Until next time, stay warm, stay safe, and sleep well.